And Ela is a junior at Southeast Polk High School. She attended Simpson Youth Academy with us, which is a week-long residency at Simpson. We spend time getting to know kind of the issues of our world, major issues happening in our world, and how we can connect that with our faith. But we also consider what we're passionate about and connect our passions with our faith. So Landon and I, we met Ela at Simpson, and after that week-long residency, each student then works on a project or a couple of projects. But Ela's project, her and I were going to present it to all of you now today, and she's got another piece she'll talk about in a second. But let me tell you a little bit more about Ela. She, like I said, she's a junior at Southeast Polk. She volunteers at Wesley Woods Camp in Indianola. She volunteers there every summer. Ela has a passion for ocean care and for creation care. You might think, how is she passionate for the ocean when she's from Iowa? We'll get to that. Ela lives here in Altoona. She has one younger sister and an awesome dad who's here. And her biggest goal in life, or one of her biggest goals in life, is to take care of the ocean throughout her life, as well as to inform others on how to best care for the earth. So will you help me welcome Ela here today? Thank you. All right, go on ahead.
So I focused like Danny said, I went to Simpson Youth Academy for a week in summer, and I turned 16 over that academy, which was super cool. But you were granted some money for a community service project after the academy was over, which is still going on, but after the in-person academy was over was when you were told about the money. And I focused my project on the issue of climate change and ocean pollution. And climate change, a lot of you probably have heard of it, but the definition of climate change is a change in global or regional weather patterns, in particular, a change apparent in the mid to late 20th century. Climate change largely attributes to the increased levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, and CO2 levels rise from fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are made up of decomposed animals, which kind of sounds gross, but it's the truth. And they contain carbon and hydrogen and can be used for motorizing cars and other vehicles, which has been a lot more popular in the 20th century. The more fossil fuels we burn, the more damage we're doing to Earth. But
both of us wanted a chance to share why climate change matters to us. And so I wanted to share just a piece about that it wasn't really until college that I had heard of the terms global warming or climate change. In case you didn't know where I went to college, it was Simpson College, a really great place. While I was there, I studied the Bible in a lot of Bible classes, and it was then that I really considered what the first commandment is that we're given by God in Genesis 1. So after God creates the entire earth, then creates the first human beings, God commands the first human beings to take care of the beautiful creation that God just spent time creating. And that's the first first commandment we are given. And then Ela and I wanted to consider also what important quotes are that have to do with creating or creation care. And this is one that I really like because it changes our mindset. It says, we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, but we borrow it from our children. And that's just a completely different way of thinking about the earth, right? A lot of times, I just shared, Eric and I bought a new house, and it's like, oh, that property is my land. Like, I own it. And this is asking me to consider it in a totally different way, to say, what if I don't look at the land as something that I own and I use for myself, but it's something that I take care of for my next, the next generation. So, so Ella's gonna share about hers too.
So climate change is really important to me because I believe that God made the ocean so his people could drink and his animals could have fit homes. I think God also made the ocean to represent wisdom and openness and strength. And the ocean plays a really important role in my everyday life, and I'm sure in a lot of other people's lives, or I'm not sure, like I know in a lot of other people's life, even if you don't see it, it still plays a really, really important role in our everyday lives and affects how we live. And a quote that stuck out to me is, "We are a part of nature, not separate from it," which is a really like good reminder of how connected we really are to the ocean and other parts of nature. So connecting climate change and ocean pollution, in the past 200 years, oceans have absorbed more than 1/3 of the CO2 produced by human activities. And as a climate's response to this is warming temperatures, and the leftover atmospheric heat gets stored in the ocean. Some like examples of increased CO2 levels, or some things that cause CO2 emissions, like fossil fuels, are the creation, use, and disposable of plastic. Plastic found in ocean animals and food, which is what we're talking about. And single-use plastic is especially harmful because it's difficult to break down. It's found everywhere, and it's technically accessible to everyone and super easy to find.
One thing, this might look kind of odd, how do you care for the ocean from Iowa? That was a question Ella and I had early on when we were considering how to care for the ocean and to do that from Iowa and to get people interested and passionate about this like we were. One way that we consider doing that is by taking care of the rivers in Iowa, because the rivers in Iowa, you can tell, I'm not tall enough, but you are. If you can reach up there where the Des Moines River is, you can see, just point there, perfect. You can see that the Des Moines River then connects into the Mississippi River, which which then connects all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. So anytime that you care for the water here in Des Moines, or any of the rivers that connect to the Mississippi, we're caring for the ocean, which is kind of an interesting thing. It's something we had thought about until this spring, or at least not me, or I guess it was in the fall. But in a minute, Ella's going to share how we're going to go and do a cleanup day this Saturday at 4 Mile Creek. And 4 Mile Creek does connect to the Des Moines River and, on. So that's kind of how we want to take care of the ocean from our home, not by going anywhere, but by doing that. Other ways to care for the ocean from Iowa or anywhere is to avoid single-use plastic. This is something I really struggle with. But the more we avoid single-use plastic, the less we have to produce single-use plastic. Refusing to litter, I think this is very accessible for any of us to do, but refusing to litter helps care for the ocean. Visiting rivers and creeks here in Iowa really helps as well, because the more you visit those places, the more you're going to care about them, the more you're going to know if they're littered or being taken care of. So the more we visit these public places, the more likely we're going to care about them. We're going to be passionate about them. And then volunteering with Des Moines Parks is another way that we can take care of the ocean, which is...
So going on from what Dani said, we did plan a community service project on Saturday from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. And free lunch is provided. It's just going to be like sandwich, chips, and water.
Who doesn't want that, y'all, right? That sounds amazing.
So half of it is going to be just like picking up trash and pollution around the water so it doesn't get into our waterways. And then the other half of it is going to be an invasive brush removal, which some of you may not know what that is, but...
We're going to tell you.
Yeah, we're going to tell you. So the definition of invasive species are an exotic organism established in warmer temperatures that become overpopulated in its new environment. Some examples of invasive species are cheatgrass, honeysuckle, and buckthorn, which we're going to be mainly focusing on removing honeysuckle on Saturday. And millions of years ago, Iowa was covered in prairies, but now only 0.1% remain, and most of it is invaded by the exotic organisms. So prairies are super important, not only to Iowa, but for ocean care as well, because They have thick, long roots that run deep into the ground and absorb chemical-filled rain runoff. And instead of the rain runoff going into the 4 Mile Creek, then the Mississippi River, then the Des Moines River, then the Mississippi River, then the Gulf of Mexico, it's just stored in those roots. And prairies also support complex food webs and isolate more atmospheric carbon per acre and per longer than a terrestrial forest would. Invasive species versus prairies. Prairies are considered native plants. Their long roots find their own water and decrease soil compaction. They find their own water, decrease soil compaction, and filter out pollutants. They are also self-sufficient plants. Native plants not only add biodiversity and beauty to an area, but reduce air and water pollution because no fertilizer or mowing is necessary.
And then this picture is one, can you see the roots okay? See how far the roots go down? Okay. This is a picture that we saw from people at the Des Moines Parks when they were trying to explain what invasive species or native plants are to us. So this is all very new to us as well, but what we learned is that non-native or invasive grasses, their roots don't go as far, which Ella kind of just explained, which means that they're not taking up as much of that water, the runoff water in the soil, and it's not as helpful to our soil as maybe these native plants would be, because the native plants are original to Iowa. These ones not necessarily, but the cheatgrass and the honeysuckle are, like Ella explained a little bit ago. But this image just kind of tells you what the difference is and how each one, or how non-natives compare to natives and how they support our ground here in Iowa. So like Ella said earlier, half of our work on Saturday with the Des Moines Parks will be picking up litter, and half of our work will be to remove some of this non-native grass and non-native plants so that we can plant native again, or repurpose native grasses, or at least let them to grow and nourish in that area, so that the water is better taken care of and the soil is better taken care of in that area near 4 Mile. Anything else you want to add?
You got it all.
Right.
Yeah, you got it all. So, connecting climate care and ocean care to the Bible. I personally connected it to the book of Genesis and the fact that water is mentioned almost 800 times in the Bible. In the book of Genesis, it basically just mentions that the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the seas. But in verse 1, it says God created the heavens and the earth. And verse 6 also mentions when the land and seas were separated. Verse 10, God mentions that God saw and claimed the land and seas as good, and his creation as good. God continued to build us, and God continued to build the earth, producing vegetation and animals and trees, so we would be able to survive, which was mentioned in verse 11. And then verse 29, God commands humans to care for the earth, which is our call to care for the ocean, pollution, or like ocean care and climate care, and just his creation as a whole. And then verse 31, God claimed everything in his creation to be good. And God has created everything, and we should try to live in the image of him and keep everything that he has created good, like he said. And then connecting this to the climate care, I've been looking at local rivers that play a huge part to oceans, leading into the oceans. Most of them are dirty and plastic-filled, polluted. And I believe that God sees this happening to his creations and yearns for something to be done about it. I think he yearns for us to become more aware of this topic and find out ways we can decrease the pollution. This can be done through donations or picking up, like we're doing on Saturday. Peaceful protest, or something as small as just picking up a plastic bag if you're walking on the ground, or picking a plastic bag off the ground if you're walking by. just so it doesn't end up in the waters. My hope is that I can help people in my community to become more aware and care more about this topic in a non-overbearing way. We can collaborate together about steps we can take while living in the image of God still.
So far we've mentioned how Genesis mentions creation, but I think maybe you said it earlier, Ella, that water is mentioned 800 times in all of Scripture. I think that's so incredible. So I did a little bit of studying, where water is, because I've just kind of passed by it in the past. So here's a couple of places Ella and I found together. You might remember the story of Moses, and if you don't remember it or don't know it, we're going to read it in a little bit more depth soon. But Moses is born into a system where young boys could not survive during his time. So his mother ended up saving his life by putting him into a basket, and he floats down a river where he's found by a woman who ends up raising him. And so water ends up saving his life, according to Exodus chapter 2. In the 23rd Psalm, which many of you may know, God leads us towards water, and we find comfort in that. So here's just first few verses. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures, and he leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul, he leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. In Isaiah chapter 55, which I quoted in my sermon this past Sunday, abundant life is found in God, which is symbolized through water. Here's the first few verses of that. It says, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. And you who have no money, come buy and eat. Yes, come buy wine and milk without money and without price. So water shows up there once again, this time about abundant life. In Jesus' baptism, of course, we find water. So in Matthew chapter 3, Luke chapter 3, Mark chapter 1, or John chapter 1. Here's from Luke chapter 3. It all sounds very similar, but Luke writes, and the Holy Spirit descended in bodily form like a dove upon him. And a voice came from heaven, which said, you are my beloved Son, in you I am well pleased. Then in John chapter 6, we find Jesus walking on water. Now when evening came, John writes, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and went over the sea toward Capernaum. And it was already dark, and Jesus had not come to them. Then the sea arose because a great wind was blowing. So when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near the boat, and they were afraid. But he said to them, it is I, do not be afraid. Then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. And also in John chapter 4, we find that water is a symbol of God's overflowing grace. When Jesus goes to the well with the woman at the well, or the Samaritan woman, Jesus answered and said to her, whoever drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water, springing up into everlasting life. So that's just a very basic example, less than 8, but you could find 800 examples of where water brings about life, where water is created, all the good things. No, you're good. Please cut me off. I'm getting excited. So we want to ask you all, maybe in just a couple small groups, maybe each table could be a small group, and Ella and I can join one of your groups. But we want you to discuss with each other, when did you first become aware about the importance of taking care of God's creation? If today is that time, that's okay. But when can you think of a time when you realized, we were called to care about the earth? So we want you to discuss among yourselves, and then we'll discuss in a large group. And we also want you to ask, what are some examples of taking care of the earth? So we've just given you some examples, especially how to take care of the ocean in Iowa, which I thought was impossible. But what are some of your favorite ways, or what are some ways that you're involved in taking care of the earth? Or what are some ways you want to? It doesn't have to be what you're doing, but also aspirational. So we're going to take 5 or so minutes to do that, talk amongst yourselves, and then we'll come back and we'll do some more studying and asking questions together. All right. Let's move on. We've got one more piece we want to do. We've got a long reading here of Exodus, a piece from Exodus 1 and Exodus 2. And I want us to ask some questions about the importance or the play of water in this from Exodus chapter 1, verse 8. It says, "Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, 'Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land.' Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom, Rameses for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in opposing tasks on the Israelites, and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks they imposed on them. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, 'When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, she shall live.' But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, 'Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?' The midwives said to Pharaoh, 'Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them.' So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, 'Every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live.'
Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it in bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. While her attendants walked beside the river, she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. 'This must be one of the Hebrews' children,' she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew woman to nurse the child for you?' Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Yes.' So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages.' So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses, because she said, 'I drew him out of the water.'"
I wanted to ask all of you, how is water important for the story of Moses that we just read aloud and read here as well? Thank you all so much. I hope you learned a lot like we have over the last year. If you think Ella did a really good job, will you let her know? Yeah.